So Hebrews chapter 11, and I'm going to start actually towards the end and read verses 32 through 40. Hebrews chapter 11. And what more shall I say? Which, by the way, that's a great line for a preacher, because you could tell he had studied too much by this point, and so he's only got a few minutes left. He's got to cram it all in. What more shall I say? Or it could be that he hadn't studied enough like some preachers and pretend like we have more prepared than we do. No, what more shall I say? For the time will fail me if I tell you of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weaknesses were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So we are taking a look at these missionary biographies, and I like to think of these men and their stories and so many others as if Hebrews 11 had an appendix. Right? So we have all these names that we see in the Bible, but if this chapter would keep being written, like through church history, like who are the names, who are the examples that we would see that, boy, they live by faith and they are a great example to us. And I think many of these missionaries are certainly that. We said last week that, of course, for every Christian, missionaries and people like them are our heroes, but they are not, as we saw last week, superheroes. In other words, they had flaws, they had weaknesses, they had sickness, they had temptations, they had trials, they had hardships, they had money problems, they had relationship problems, all kinds of things. And so let's put them, maybe we can say on a pedestal, but not too far up on a pedestal. Only Christ belongs on the throne. None of these missionaries do. But we certainly look to them and want to follow them as they followed Jesus. But they clearly had a real faith in a real God, and I think it's a great encouragement and challenge to us as well. So we talked about, we've already said David Brainerd last week. So the story of missions is the story of people. And tonight, the person we're going to look at is a man by the name of Henry Martyn. Who has ever heard the name Henry Martyn? If you're taking notes or mental notes, it's Martyn with a Y. So if you're going to Google it, search it later, it's M-A-R-T-Y-N, Henry Martyn. So the fastest, well, it depends on who you ask. I'll put it that way. Maybe this should all have an asterisk next to it. But according to missiologists, the fastest growing church, and by that I mean just like spread of Christianity in any nation in the world right now, many people say it's China. The hard part about that is we don't have a lot of actual hard data because a lot of it's underground church and there's a lot of, sort of things. So that's kind of a speculation based on population and so forth. So that very well may be the case. But in terms of hard data and statistics, I recently read that the fastest growing, not the largest, that's important, but the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran. Now that sounds probably surprising to our ears. It's not that there's a huge Christian population. It's how quickly it's grown from the time that it was there. The report that I read showed that in 1979, there was less than 500 known Christians in Iran. Today, which that's when I was born, 1979. So 42 years later, there is an estimated 1 million Christians in Iran. So if you do the math, that is explosive growth from just 500, like a church our size, essentially, to 1 million people in 40 years, all across the nation, right? So that's incredible. But let's ask a more basic question. Where did those 500 come from? Right? In this Muslim-dominated, area, 1979, where did that even, how did Christianity ever even get there in the first place? Well, that all goes back to the story we're going to learn tonight of Henry Martyn. Henry Martyn was born in 1781 in England. The southern coast, it's kind of a beach town. We think of Virginia Beach or something like that. His father, I think his name was John, was a shrew merchant. Now, I had to go Google what a shrew was because I didn't know. I knew it was some kind of animal. I didn't know that the shrew market was so good back in the 1700s because his father was very rich from selling shrews. I don't know do you eat shrews? I have no idea what you do with a shrew. But anyhow, he made a very good living and had quite a bit of money, so he grew up with some privilege that way. His family consisted of an older brother and a younger sister named Sally, and she's going to be important to the story, so remember that. But after his sister was born, his mother died. And so Henry Martyn was raised in a single-parent home. If you remember last week, Brainerd was an orphan pretty much most of his life. And so Martyn was raised in this way. As a boy, he had a very difficult time in school. He was said to have a really bad temper, even as a small child, and was often got in trouble in the schools for fighting on the playgrounds and fighting other kids. As he got older in life, this apparently continued to plague him because there's one story that I think as a teenager, he got into a scuffle with a guy and pulled a knife and tried to stab him. And it was well known that was that hot-headed Martyn who had done this. But Martyn was known for fighting kids on the playground and all of this. But despite his very small stature and sort of fighting spirit, his teachers recognized something unique about him when he was little, and that this Martyn boy was incredibly bright. Smarter than the other kids in his class, smarter than many of the kids in the school. And so his teachers thought that, well, maybe he's getting into trouble because he's bored, essentially, that he needs to be challenged more. And so the teachers tried something, and they took Henry Martyn as a young child, I don't know exactly what age, but young child, and basically put him in like high school with the older kids. And he instantly took to it. And I guess today we would say he was like a savant of some kind because he started learning classical languages as a small child, Latin and Greek, and became the smartest kid in basically the high school where he was attending at that time. He earned the respect of even these much older kids that he was with, or teenagers, and had this reputation for being an incredibly bright young man. So here he is, way out of his league in terms of age, but quite brilliant and smart. But you can imagine that comes with some challenges, socially. To add to that, Henry Martyn, while he was very intellectually bright, he described himself as being physically unattractive. If you Google Henry Martyn and look up his picture, of course they're drawings that we have, but they're like most pictures, they're just profiles, kind of here, But according to his journals, Martyn was actually, his hands and legs and arms were covered in warts. And he felt so just embarrassed by this, and it was so unsightly that he had a hard time, making friends. He thought he would never get married, that anyone would love him. And he writes a great deal about how much he felt rejected, and he would rather spend his time alone in the library. He'd rather spend his time by himself reading and learning because he didn't feel like he would ever be able to fit in with others or anyone would care for him that way. And so Martyn threw himself into his studies and continued to excel. He talks about at one point that he remembers the first time he ever heard Bible preaching, that in Cornwall where he was, that a famous preacher was coming to town, and his father took him to hear this man named John Wesley. So Christianity is not as big as we think sometimes, like worlds colliding. He remembers hearing John Wesley. And at the time, John and Charles Wesley, of course, as you know, the brothers not only were preachers, but also hymn writers. And they were writing some of the like praise songs we would think of today, like contemporary songs that they would sing. And Henry Martyn talks about learning those songs even young in life, and how later in life it was those songs that he sung to himself while he was all alone in the streets of Calcutta and other places. He says that the Wesley songs reminded him of Cornwall, they reminded him of home, and reminded him of God, and he clung to those, which I think it's ironic. He was an Anglican. I think it's ironic that this Calvinist loved a Wesleyan songs so much. There's nothing greater than when Calvinists loved the Wesleyans like that. But nevertheless, he enjoyed Wesley's songs and ministry. So he loved the songs of the Wesleys, but that was not the only thing that Henry Martyn loved. When he was a teenager, there was a girl that he met and fell in love with. It was his cousin's sister-in-law. I'm not sure the relationship. There's no relationship, I guess, in his sister-in-law. But her name was Lydia. And Lydia was 6 years older than him. And he felt like, given his physical appearance, given the age difference, given some of his social awkwardness, that surely she would never go for him. But he writes about how smitten he was with her in his journals. He wrote in one case, quote, that he loved her passionately. Quote, "I could not stop thinking about her. I wake in the night and my mind is full of her." So Martyn is just, like any teenage boy, just head over heels in thinking about her. And so he took a chance as a teenager and sort of approached her and began talking to her and wooing her and courting her. And Lydia reciprocated, much to his surprise. And he was thrilled. And so they began a courting relationship and continued to work through that. When he completed his grammar school, or basically his high school, he went off to Cambridge because he was so bright, that was the place to go. And even at Cambridge, he instantly rocketed to the top of the class. It was obvious that he was brilliant. He received a degree, high honors in mathematics, and he was so bright that when he graduated Cambridge, they hired him as a professor. So at 21, he became a professor there, fully tenured at the school. While he was there, though, at Cambridge, and now the year is 1802, so again, he's still 21 years of age, Martyn went to a church there called Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge. I've been there. It's still in existence right there on the cobblestone streets right up from the school. Very old historic church. And it was pastored by a man named Charles Simeon. Now, I want to geek out about Charles Simeon. I will resist the urge. Matthew knows Charles Simeon.
You should geek out.
I made him write a paper about Charles Simeon. I spent several years in my doctoral work studying Charles Simeon. I should talk about him more because I spent so much time with this man. I feel like I know him better. But let me go on a little detour about Charles Simeon because this is an incredible story when you start sort of getting connecting some of these dots. So Charles Simeon was the pastor at Holy Trinity Church right up from Cambridge. He did some teaching at the school but was primarily the pastor of the church. By the way, the church hated him. When he showed up the first Sunday, he preached. That night, they disliked him so much, they locked the front doors so he couldn't have evening service. And Charles Simeon said, "I don't need a pulpit to preach." And he stood on the porch and just preached to anybody, because it's in the middle of Cambridge. He just preached to anybody that would walk past. And eventually, he gained a love for the community and the people in return, and Charles Simeon stayed there for his entire life, pastoring the church, and it was packed by the time he died. He was so well loved in the community. But this guy, Charles Simeon, took an interest in the students, knowing that he could mentor them and shape them. And so he started inviting students to his home to have tea and biscuits, cookies, not biscuits, tea and biscuits to talk about the sermon and the church and their education and spending time with them, helping them to grow and do this. Now, some of you that may know, when I was studying Charles Simeon, I came across that, and I studied it, and I thought, that is incredible. And so about 7 years ago, I started a similar group. We have a much better menu. We serve tacos at my house. We've done it for 7 years now. Matthew's in the group, Mason's been part of the group, and it's any young men or ladies in our church who feel called to ministry, and they come on Monday nights, and we talk about sermons, we talk about seminary, we talk about those kinds of things, just so that, and God has sent out, I could name some names you would all know who are now pastors and youth pastors that have come through our doors, and I've had the chance to do that. And it was literally, I got the idea reading about Charles Simeon. And what makes it incredible is that Henry Martyn joined this group at Charles Simeon's house. Well, sitting around the same table was another young man at Cambridge named William Wilberforce, the abolitionist. So here they are in college, learning from this pastor who's telling them how to put their faith into practice for the things that they're going to do. Wilberforce goes into politics, and Henry Martyn eventually, of course, goes, as you'll hear, to the mission field. So Charles Simeon may be one of the most important pastors we've never heard of, whose impact lives on. So the story goes that at one of those gatherings, Charles Simeon said, I want to talk tonight about somebody you might not have heard of, a man by the name of William Carey. He's a Baptist who's doing work in India, and I want you to know the great things that he's accomplishing. And there was something about that was said that night that captured Henry Martyn's heart and mind and began to do a great work in him. And he later talked about how that made such a difference that he was going to leave the comforts of England and make his way to India. Now, we kind of got to a point in his life, right? So I'm going to back up just a little bit and talk about his conversion and how we got to there. So while he was at Cambridge, his father died, so he traveled home to be with his brother and sister. And while he was there, he was talking with his sister Sally, his younger sister. His younger sister was a very devout believer and Christian, very full in her faith. And she told Martyn that ever since he left, or even before that, but even while he was gone, she had been praying fervently for him to become a Christian. And Henry Martyn was confused because he thought he was a Christian. He was, you're in England, right? There's the Church of England. Of course we're all Christians, right? It's a Christian nation, and I was sprinkled, and sure, I'm a Christian. I heard John Wesley, in his mind, that's what it was. But she knew that he had never been converted, and she said that she had prayed for him. And so Martyn said, I began to consider seriously, this is his journal, the invisible world to which my father had gone and to what I would one day go. So I took up my Bible. Oh, how my pious little Sally must have prayed for that moment. I concluded that now was the time for me to consider religion in this solemn hour. Martyn said he began to read the book of Acts. He began to read parts of the New Testament, and he learned some things, but he was talking to others about some things he was confused about, essentially, and they said, you need to read the Gospels. So Martyn said, I began to read the Gospels, and he said, quote, in there I did not discover a doctrine, I found a person. And that person changed my life. He said, quote, the work of Christ is real. I can no more doubt it than I can doubt my own existence. The whole current of my desires has now been altered, and I am now walking in quite another way than I once was. And so he comes to faith in Christ after his father's death and begins to read his Bible. Well, he meets Jesus, right, in this, and not long after that, you know what he met next? David Brainerd. We talked about him last week. He got the Life and Diary of David Brainerd by Jonathan Edwards, and he started reading it. And he said in his journal, quote, I read Brainerd today, and I feel my heart knit to this dear man, and I really think it must be, and really rejoice to think of meeting him in heaven one day. I long to be like David Brainerd. And so he read this book and was captivated. So this was happening in the background. He is at Cambridge, goes back to Cambridge, is talking to Simeon, and God is using all of this in his life. And so where David Brainerd made his way to the Indians of America, Martyn said he was going to go to the Indians of Asia in the direction of William Carey. So his first order of business was to tell Lydia. And so he went to her to say that he was preparing for the mission field and that they were to be married. And she agreed as he was telling her this, but she said, but with one exception. And he wrote in his diary, she immediately said, quote, "Henry, I will go with you anywhere except India." And Martyn was crushed. He fell to his knees, pleaded with her to reconsider, but she adamantly refused. For months, he wrote her and begged her to change her mind, but she had set her mind that she wasn't going to go. Martyn wrote, "I had to ask myself, do I love Lydia more or do I love India more?" And he said, the more I pondered the question, I came to realize it was not Lydia or India. For me, it was Lydia or God. And so Martyn wrote in his diary, quote, "I have cheerfully resigned to do the will of God and forego the earthly joy of marriage." Just think about that. That he was so convinced of God's calling to go, he gave up the woman he loved to do this. Even though he left Lydia in England, he never stopped loving her. In fact, fast forward, after he died, his trunk was brought back to his sister Sally, and when she opened it up, she said hundreds of love letters poured out of the top that he had written over the years to Lydia that he never mailed and gave to her. So, Martyn said, well, if she's not going, he needed to prepare himself to go to India, and so he began disciplining himself. He instantly gave away all of his earthly possessions. He started rationing his food to get used to eating and living on less. I don't know if that's what IMB training is like, but this seems awful adventurous on his part. Of his self-discipline, he wrote, "I ate my breakfast today standing at a distance from the fire, though the thermometer stood still at the freezing point. I rejoice that God has made my life a time of trial, preparing me for what's to come." He was appointed as a chaplain with the East India Company in 1806, and he was just 25 years of age. So, 21, right, somewhere around there he becomes a Christian, a believer, and in a very short time begins to make his way to India with the East India Company. So he leaves this posh career as a professor at Cambridge with all the sort of accolades and academia that came with it to go where the gospel had never been made known. On the way from England to India, they stopped over at the Cape of Good Hope, bottom of South Africa there, and there was a war between the British and the South Africans there. And because he was a chaplain, they stopped over for him to spend some time ministering as they sort of outfitted the ships so he could care for the dying and anyone that needed it. And seeing the horrors of war and seeing the death there, Martyn reflected on two things. He reflected on the importance of eternity and that life was short and that people are going to die and they need Jesus. But he also reflected on his nation. And he said, "I feel that it's not Britain's job to colonize the world, but to convert the world. England should stop sending soldiers abroad and start sending more missionaries abroad." So I don't know if anybody else in England read that, but it's what he wrote in his journals. So he landed in India and began working with William Carey, the Baptist missionary that was there. Which, by the way, he was an Anglican, he was a Baptist. I love the fact that they got along and could do missionary work. That's just an incredible little side note there. William Carey instantly realized this guy is brilliant and that ordinary missionary work, quote unquote, in terms of preaching and teaching would not be as useful as something else that Martyn could do for them. And so Carey pleaded with him to spend his time and his effort in Bible translation. He knew that his background in the languages and his ability to learn so quickly was something that they could reproduce faster and actually would help the missionaries long term. And so given his love for knowing Greek and picking up languages so quickly, he leaped at the opportunity. And so Martyn said he set about learning as many languages as he could in the marketplaces and talking to neighbors and people and trying to figure out, just to orient himself. He actually did some preaching and teaching, and eventually he actually helped start with William Carey a couple of schools because he knew that if they could raise the literacy level, then the translation work would have a place to land with the younger generation. So he helped start a couple of schools with a few, like a little preaching and teaching, but most of his time was spent day and night translating the Bible into the languages of the people. So he began, all right, get ready for this. He began with Hindustani, what was the common language of nearly 60 million people estimated at that point. When Martyn started his translation work, Hindustani wasn't yet a standardized written language. So think about this. Missionaries go to the field, right? They might spend 3, 4, 5 years or more learning the language, okay? Martyn has to learn the language, right? And then he has to learn to write the language. And not only that, but actually create the language for these people to make sense for them for literacy's sake, right? Because spoken and written are two different things. And so he set himself out to do this. He worked day and night by candlelight to complete the work that he did. And eventually he finished translating the New Testament into Hindustani, which is still in circulation to this day, by the way. He then set out to translate the New Testament into, for what he called the, quote, Mohammedans. Anybody know what a Mohammedan is? Yeah, it's an old-timey way of saying a Muslim, or to speak of Islam, those followers of Muhammad, the Mohammedans. And so he realized that Arabic was such a huge language in that region because of the influence of Islam, that if he could translate the New Testament into Arabic, it could make a huge difference. And so he hired some Muslim tutors, and they began teaching him the language so that he could speak it and write. He said, quote, I'm reading everything that I can find written by a Mohammedan, he said. He spent hours and days working on his translation, and once he finished the work, he said, quote, so now praise God, we will be able to preach the gospel to Arabia, Syria, Persia, India, Tartary, which is Iran, China, Turkey, half of Africa, and all of the southern Mediterranean, and one tongue will suffice for them all. So he knew that this work had such huge potential and impact all over. So he not only translated the New Testament into Hindustani and Arabic, he also found time to translate it into Persian. So he learned a third language while he was there, and being the perfectionist that he was, he thought that his Persian translation of the New Testament was inferior, so he went back and did it again and translated the entire thing from scratch into Persian. He also translated the Gospels into Judeo-Persic, which is a dominant language in Iran, and the Book of Common Prayer into Urdu. And so when you start to add up the amount of works that he translated, both full New Testaments, the Gospels themselves, and other works that he did, it's really unparalleled in all of church history. Like, nobody has done the amount of translation work that Henry Martyn did. Now, that's incredible, okay? But that's not the most incredible part of this story, right? As incredible as that sounds. The most incredible part of the story is something that Martyn himself almost seemed to predict. When he landed in India the very first day, and he was walking through the streets of Calcutta, and he had met William Carey, and he realized that he had arrived on the field and the calling of God and everything was now coming to play, Henry Martyn wrote in his journal that night one simple sentence: now may I burn out for God. So Henry Martyn left England at 25, translated the New Testament into 3 languages, the Gospels into a 4th language, Book of Common Prayer, started schools, and died at the age of 31. Six years. It is astounding every time I say it. He worked night and day, used every faculty that he had for the sake of the gospel and for the people that might know. He made his way from India up into Iran at one point to take his Arabic translation to debate the Mohammedans so that they might come to know the gospel. And there's actually a letter from some sheikh, whatever. There's a letter that they have on file, I don't know exactly where, but I saw a copy of it, where he thanked England for sending Henry Martyn, for giving them this sacred text in a beautiful way that they could understand and read for themselves. So you have this Muslim cleric complimenting Henry Martyn in what he did. To this day, you can find churches and missionary groups in India that trace their records back to Henry Martyn. In fact, as I was preparing for this, like David Brainerd, I got online to see there's actually a couple of videos, so if you've got some YouTubing, you can watch it later there. But here's what I discovered very quickly, and I didn't catch it at first, and then I went back and realized it. If you search it on YouTube and it comes up, the first couple are kind of normal sort of documentaries, then everything under that, it's from India. Talking about Henry Martyn. Talking about the impact of his legacy. Like, you can't understand it because it's in some other language, but these hour-long videos about him and the impact and the difference that he made. It was just incredible to think about. So how was he able to do everything that he did? If you kind of look at his journals and the things that he wrote, it really was because Henry Martyn was gripped by the reality of eternity. Whether it was the death of his mother or the death of his father later, or his own sort of some of his sicknesses and frailties, he wrote often about eternity. His very last journal entry, Henry Martyn wrote, quote, "Oh, when shall time give way to eternity? When shall the new heavens and the new earth finally appear? When shall the miseries of this mortality be neither seen nor heard of any more?" And so he committed himself to that new heavens and that new earth and to reach people with the gospel as well. If you go to Cambridge today, there is a building there that for the last 100 years was known as the Henry Martyn Center. It's now called the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, maybe an even more fitting title in light of his legacy, because the impact is still rippling out from all over the world. So, why did we read Hebrews 11? Because when I think of Henry Martyn, I think of that little parenthetical phrase in verse 38 where the author says, "Men of whom the world was not worthy." A man who was so dedicated to Christ. A man who gave every second of every day from the time of his conversion to the end of his life, his very short life, to use it for the glory of Christ and the sake of the gospel. He was an incredible young man that I think is such a great challenge to us.